Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 162 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, I am super excited to be joined by two subject matter experts joining us all the way from the United Kingdom. I have been following the work of Robin Moore and Tammie Burroughs for quite some time now. In fact, one of my initial sources of information when I was first going down the Desistance from Crime rabbit hole was the Academic Insights publication, which we are about to highlight with my two guests. Robin Moore is the head of research at HM Inspectorate of Probation. He is the strategic lead on research and analysis in HMI probation, reviewing and contributing to the policy and operational evidence base for probation and youth offending services, ensuring that the inspection standards and organizational positions are evidence-based, and providing technical advice so that all inspections are as robust and impactful as possible. We are also joined by Tammie Burroughs, who is going to tell us all about her recently new position as Community Sentence Management Team at HM Prison and Probation Service. Now, joining us all the way from Great Britain, please enjoy my conversation with Robin Moore and Tammie Burroughs, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Robin and Tammie. I've been planning this for so long, but as we've noted, we all have such busy schedules, but I'm thrilled to finally get you on the Criminologist podcast. Why don't we start off by each of you telling us just a little bit about yourselves, generally speaking, maybe some of those educational and vocational milestones that you've encountered on your journey, and then we'll do a deeper dive on some of these questions.
Great, thank you, Joe. A pleasure to be on the show. And so background started a long time ago with a law degree initially. It was a law degree at Oxford that got me into criminal justice and criminology. So after that degree, I always worked within criminal justice and always within research. So over 20 years now, all different parts of criminal justice, so courts, sentencing, probation, prisons, youth justice, but never policing. That's sort of one side that I've not been involved in. Initially within academia, and then more recently, for quite some time within government agencies, both really fascinating.
I think the key to resiliency, Robin, is moving around such as you have. And I always tell young students or practitioners just entering the field to not limit themselves, and as you just indicated, move around, explore, and really learn as much as there is around what drives you, what your why is, so to speak. Tammie, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on. So a bit about me, I guess I want to just briefly touch on school. I always thought I wouldn't be able to study as hard as I could, but people told me that I wouldn't amount to anything because of my circumstances. So I had a real drive to prove them wrong. Studied psychology at university and then became a lorry driver for my stepdad's company and volunteered in drug and alcohol counselling. And the lady who ran that drug and alcohol counselling services, she worked for probation and she introduced me to probation, and then I've never looked back. And interesting what you just said about moving around, because my first university lecturer in the probation degree I did, Mike Nellis said, move around every 4 years, which is something I did in terms. So I've worked in IOM, in prison, street projects, all sorts, but all in probation.
I always find it fascinating, Tammie, how people get into the field. Like you said, some folks start thinking they want to get into law enforcement or psychology. It sometimes seems it's the exception to the rule that the freshman, the undergraduate, whoever says, I want to be a probation or parole officer when I grow up, but we still attract such a wide variety of folks. I think that's really, that diversity is a strength in the end. Robin, you are currently head of research at HM Inspector of Probation. I happen to love research, and in particular, evidence-based practices that research yields. You've clearly done plenty of work in this arena. Could you speak to your approach? And I love this approach of combining research, both quantitative and qualitative, with the lived experience of clients and stakeholders, and then, of course, the experience of practitioners in the field, sort of that trifecta of viewpoints.
Yeah, of course. So you won't be surprised to hear that I also love research. And I think I'll take the opportunity to talk more broadly about evidence as well. So I've been working within criminal justice research for over 20 years and strongly believe in the value of research evidence. And in the Inspectorate's a great place to work. So I've been here for now over 7 years. In fact, it's flown by. Really great place to work because there's a strong belief in the need for services to be evidence-based or else evidence-led. So we have this strategic aim to reduce reoffending, taking all reasonable steps to keep the public safe. And the view is this is most likely if practice is aligned to the evidence base and if this evidence base continues to grow over time. So we're totally committed to reviewing, developing, promoting this all-important evidence base for high-quality services. So a key source of evidence is research evidence, but we do use that alongside our inspection knowledge and findings, and that incorporates the views of both practitioners and those supervised. So it's the key is bringing it all together. It's this triangulation, really, and it's this that helps inform our understanding of what helps and what hinders services, and we use this to develop our inspection programs and our guidance and all the effective practice products that Tammie works so brilliantly on, and also to consider system-wide change, actually, that just can ultimately change lives for the better. In terms of research, we collaborate with academics, external researchers in numerous ways. We're always looking to utilise and maximise the knowledge, experience, skills that are across the whole research community. So it's about trying to build a rounded and balanced view of the evidence base, or avoid partiality, recognising the evidence base never stands still, so it continually evolves, and we should never look too narrowly in one place. Something we also think really carefully about is so these concepts of knowledge translation and knowledge mobilisation. So it's not simply one-way dissemination, but it's meaningful engagement and interaction with research findings and its implications. So this podcast, I think, is a good way of demonstrating that. And it's this is really important, I think, when we all recognise that evidence and experience, they're not the only drivers of change. It sits alongside lots of other drivers, such as values, resources is obviously a big one, and political ideologies and interests, and these different drivers are balanced in different ways at different times. So it's always really important that we push forward the research evidence. And in terms of knowledge translation, I think it's important to then think about differing dissemination methods. So how to combine accessibility with that academic credibility and rigour, and recognising there's a range of preferences really in terms of format and style. So with this in mind, we recently produced an online evidence resource where we summarise key research findings and present them as concisely as possible. And we're also about to launch some new 5-minute reflection videos featuring leading academics that they reflect upon their work set out their top pieces of advice for the delivery of high quality services. So it's short videos with key points that can be digested quickly for those short on time. And we have to be, really honest and realistic about this. Many practitioners are short on time.
So much I would love to unpack with you, Rob, and I'm already seeing a future interview with the both of you at some point for the Criminologist podcast. But one of the things you talked about, you said, the science, the research never stands still. I could not agree more. And I don't want to turn this into a political science podcast, but oftentimes we hear whatever the topic is about, well, the science is settled on this. The science is settled on this. And my head explodes because science by its very nature is never settled, whether it's global warming or economy or whatever. So I really applaud that spirit that you bring, that the science is never settled. I reflect back on, and understand there was a point when, in particular, the risk need responsivity framework was just taking off. And there was almost an effort to label things that weren't addressing, for example, the big four as correctional quackery or not hitting the mark. But now when I look and I interview folks, those same things that 20 years ago weren't considered evidence-based, like yoga and mindfulness in prisons or things of that nature, are now gaining efficacy. So I think we really do need to keep an open mind and explore all future possibilities and realize, as you said, that the science never stands still. Tammie, I know you recently transitioned into a new role as effective practice lead of probation to becoming a member of the community sentence management team. I hope I got my research right here. Talk about your new role, if you would, please, Tammie.
Yeah, definitely talk about my new role, but I just want to mention my old role just because I can't not plug the HMIP's effective practice stuff. So I think that role was fairly new when I started it, and I think I was really privileged to be able to shape what the approach was to it. For me, it was really important to use that opportunity to kind of demystify the HMIP standards. So I would say the aim of that product was really to share examples of where we saw our standards delivered well, but also to bring the different perspectives to that standard. So we would see something out on inspection, we would share it from the perspective of the practitioner, if you like. Then we would talk about why HMIP felt it met our standards and how it did. And then we also would then link it to the research. So a lot of the effective practice products have links to Robin's work or the academic insights papers, just to remind people that their practice is absolutely based in that evidence. And then where possible, also bring in the perspectives of those people on probation about the impact this has when we do it right. So I think for me, what was really interesting is to get that national picture about what's being delivered, how demographics are affecting it, how local systems are helping us to gain more insight. And I think in particular, because a lot of my experience has been with the adult sector, bar a few short stints in youth, I learned so much about the youth justice sector. And I think for me, from an adult perspective, I felt there was stuff that we could take from it. So the impact of speech and language therapists that are embedded into the youth justice system, I think if we had the resource to do that in the adult system as well, would be brilliant. We in England, we do a pre-sentence report for court to help sentencers decide the best possible option for people. And in the youth justice sector, they've kind of flipped that report on its head. So they talk about the child first and what's happening in the child's life. Then they talk about the offence. And what happens then is the sentencers look at the offence in the context of the individual rather than the other way around. I'd love to see us do that in the adult sector, but it's a very different things. So transitioned into the community sentence management team now, and we set kind of policy standards for core probation practitioner tasks. So things like national standards around reporting frequency, about when you should go and do home visits. And one of the tasks I've been given specifically is this whole suite of approved toolkits. So in effect, they're guidance around structured conversations for people to have in those one-to-one sessions in the room. They're all very much desistance based, all very much strength based, just to kind of support that relational work. And for me, that there is absolutely nothing like the probation service. I think it's really rare to find work where you've got to use your engagement powers so much that you simultaneously hold people to account, but impose controls on them, but also being like super supportive and trying to facilitate that change. And I know Hazel Kemshaw frequently refers to that as supportive authority, which I'm sure Robin will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think is based on a paper by Bush around cognitive self-change. So I really like that relational aspect of probation. But I kind of, if you don't mind indulging me for a second, what I was really interested to think about in that question is the whole point of transition. So me transitioning to this new role, I think is just so apt, because I always find it quite a challenge personally when I go into a new role in my career. And this one felt quite significant because I was joining a unified service that was taken into the Ministry of Justice. So it felt quite huge to me. It felt unfamiliar. So I am now in a position where I've got to make new connections. I've got to figure out who are the people who are going to help me, who are my enablers. I felt a need to prove my value, my skill set. I've got to navigate this massive infrastructure that I don't know anything about. I've questioned who I am, what I bring to it. I've wondered why I've done it at times. And I'm not saying that because I want people to feel sorry for me, but just thought it was an interesting illustration of the challenges I faced when transitioning into a new role. You know where I'm going here, Joe, I can tell. But I'm not saying my experiences are the same as the challenges that other people face in their transitions, but it's interesting. It's a choice that I've made, but it's not smooth sailing, even though it's something I wanted. And I know it potentially is going to be hard to sustain. There's going to be hiccups and bumps in the road, and that's going to make me want to run back to my familiar patterns. I want to run back to HMIP. And I think the same with people on probation we work with. I think it's really important in that sense. Oh, well, if you think about the desistance theory, like I know I've got to recognise the strengths that I bring to this role. I've got to build those professional relationships, both the kind of the formal ones, but also who I can let my mask clip to a bit. I've got to recognise there was some agency in my decision. I've got to acknowledge that, you know, I am making progress, but I need to be realistic about what I am. I'm going to grow into it. And I just think personal reflections like that can help us with our practice, because we understand change is hard, and it's no different for someone who's trying to transition from a pro-offending kind of identity to that pro-social one.
Listeners can't see me smiling, Tammie. We're doing this via video, so you can see me smiling, and I could not agree more with where you're going there. It's really, I tell folks, it's really boils down to practice what you preach, really. I've been blessed to have been doing a lot of consulting and traveling around the world, and when I look back at what I was doing 5 years ago, yes, I was an evidence-based practice trainer, but you could not have told me that I would be traveling to Europe, traveling to the Middle East, traveling to Australia. But to your point, Tammie, when people say, well, how did you do that, Joe? I said, well, I looked at desistance theory, really, which we could break down into building your human capital, building your social capital, which I've done via this podcast, making all these great connections around the world, and then really just going through that identity transformation. I literally updated my LinkedIn page one day to change my header to international consultant. And I just sort of grew into that role. And like I said, now I've got trademarks on my passport for all the traveling I do. But to your point, it's a parallel process with the clients we serve. It's the same fears, the same challenges, the same reliance on our social support networks. And again, it really boils down to that identity transformation. So I love it. It's a great example. We can point to our own lives as sort of a petri dish that these theories really do work, Tammie. Yeah, that was great insight. We have a mutual connection in the incredible Dr. Sarah Lewis. I was thrilled to see a bit of collaboration taking place between you all in the shape of an academic insights paper that Dr. Lewis and her colleague Emma Hans authored. But can you speak to that experience? I just love Sarah and everything she does.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one of the approaches we adopted for reviewing and promoting the evidence base. We commissioned these academic insights papers and launched them in 2019, so not that long ago. And leading academics and researchers present their views on specific topics, again, to assist with informed debate and aid our understanding of what helps and hinders services. Nearing 50 papers in total. I'm not quite sure how that's happened. From a wide range of academics across differing institutions, so really differing areas of expertise and backgrounds. Some England and Wales, but then also some from other jurisdictions. So there is an international flavour as well, and some are by very well-known and established academics, and others by academics at an earlier stage in their career, and we've got some great ones coming up, including one by James Bonter summarising the risk-need responsivity model and the full model as it is now. But yeah, as you say, Emma Hans and Sarah Lewis, they were kind enough to produce one of the papers for us, and how that came about. I'd read an article they'd produced for the International Association for Correctional and Forensic Psychology. And it was all about their growth model. And it's just really fascinating. I could immediately see how it would be helpful to summarise the relevant evidence, so the evidence that underpins it, and the implications for those delivering probation services. I really like the focus on how to grow an organisation and the culture within it. I'm absolutely fascinated by organisational culture, and I really like the 6 core conditions they set out to drive a growth culture. So these being to understand the context, the importance of relationships and identity, and the importance of a strengths-based approach, as Tammie was just talking about, and broadening out the whole system through inclusivity, the need for early preventative work, and then thinking also about sustainability. And really familiar messages here. I think you see this across a lot of differing research areas, and such as the need for a whole system approach, that strong focus on relationships, as well as that need to think about embedding change, so you're not short-term fixes. And I think we see lots of examples, I think, of short-term fixes, but in terms of delivering those longer-term benefits that we're all looking for, you really need that focus on that long-term embedding. So yeah, just a fascinating paper I read, a brilliant paper they produced for us, and yeah, really, really grateful for that piece of work.
I think if I can reflect on it as well, and the concept of growth, I think, is so important for probation practitioners in particular. I think people with that growth mindset have got that real desire to explore, learn and understand, and that's got to help us in terms of when we're doing assessments on people and we're almost making a hypothesis about what is the risk, where's that come from, and just seeing beyond those obvious immediate things. That whole persisting in the face of obstacles, and making that continuous effort to develop. I really related to the underlying concepts of that paper, and I know it's pitched at transformative organisations. I think the principles are actually really relevant to the individuals that are going through transformative change, or that transitioning that I was talking about before. And the key thing to that is relationships. So I really enjoyed the link to the relational work and identity, because I think if we've got good relationships with people, we understand more about who they are, we can then engage people more effectively and be a lot more specific in our tailoring of support. And that is HMIP's case management standards do reference a personalised approach. HMPPS, sorry, that's too many acronyms. The Probation and Prison Service, we love them over here in the UK. So the Probation and Prison Service, we talk very much about that importance of responsivity within our work. So I think having that understanding of the individual's identity and responding accordingly. I think the organisation that Sarah and Emma represent, Penal Reform Solutions, have also worked alongside the Inspectorate undertaking peer research for our thematic reports, and they worked specifically on electronic monitoring, the mental health report, and MAPA, which stands for Multi-Agency Public Protection Arrangements. So they produce reports and podcasts, and it helped inform our recommendations. And there's also lots of links to their work in our effective practice guides for those things. So they can be found on the Inspectorate's website, if I can plug it very quickly there.
Of course. That's what you're here for, Tammie. Yeah, I had the honor of being recruited by Sarah and her Penal Reform Solutions team. So I've trained that growth program overseas for her in foreign prison systems. And you're right, it's shocking how much a lot of things boil down to that relationship piece. And it gets back to what we were saying earlier as far as this parallel process goes. It's just human nature, really. We've been talking about identity. I recently had a conversation with a colleague over here in the United States as to the evolving role of the probation officer and their sort of vocational identity. We have an expression here in the United States. I'm not sure if this will resonate in the UK, but that expression is, well, we wear two hats. Sometimes we're an agent of the court, more of that law enforcement role, but sometimes we put on our social worker change agent hat. And the more I've been reflecting upon this lately, I'm thinking we do need to go through an identity transformation, because I'm just really wondering how those two roles exist and the expectation that we put on the officer to turn those hats on and off, or to flip that switch from one day doing an unannounced home search in a client's home with your badge on and your bulletproof vest and you're surrounded by the local sheriffs. But the next day, the expectation is that you're in your office doing motivational interviewing and exploring criminogenic need and evoking their reasons for change. I just wonder if that disconnect is working. What are your thoughts on that, or what does that look like in the UK as far as if you to ask your practitioners, your POs, what is your identity?
So I think that's a really tricky question, and I think we're in an interesting place at the moment, I think, in England and Wales, because we've been through so much change recently, and particularly on the adult probation side, we've had big reforms. So we had the transforming rehabilitation phase, and now we've moved back to a more unified service. So I think at the moment, in terms of England and Wales, I think there are big questions around identity, around professionalisation, but I think it's actually at a higher level, to be honest, Joe, than I think you're describing at the moment. We've had issues with losing staff, losing experienced staff. We've had basically staff shortages, so real resource pressures. Lots of new staff now coming in, so fast recruitment at the moment, but it's going to take time, obviously, for the new staff to develop their skills, develop their experience. So there's a huge amount of need for, I think, ongoing investment, developing professional knowledge, expertise, autonomy, but across all the sort of different areas of the work. I think before we start drilling down into the different sides, there's just this general need to resource the service really well, to develop all the new staff coming in. They need to be supported clearly by management and at the leadership level. And it's just a fascinating time. We published a paper last year which was all around professionalism in probation, produced by another academic, Matt Tidmarsh, and he covered a lot of these points about the need for investment and developing professional knowledge, etc. And he also made the really interesting point that with all the changes that are being made, and whenever you're thinking about reforms to probation, the history and the culture of probation needs to be respected and to recognise its core identity. So he says, and I would agree, that its core identity is a relational, collaborative and person-centred service. So I think that's what you've always got to come back to. However you then set up the system, that's the core identity. You can never lose that. And lots of developments at the moment. There was a publication of a policy, interim policy last month, which introduced a professional register and professional standards for probation qualified staff. And it sets out 7 professional standards, which includes one which requires staff to seek new opportunities to enhance and continually improve their practice. And this, this is really interesting, because I would argue that there needs to be a much stronger commitment to building a sort of a research evidence-based culture, which is really sort of hardwired into the whole delivery model. And you could say that a cultural shift's actually required here, whereby supporting, co-producing or instigating research is recognised as a key part of the job. Commitment to upskilling staff so that they have a sufficient understanding of the role of research and evaluation. I think some do. Others, I think, are less clear about the role and value of research. And crucially, staff need to be given time, space and resources to continually reflect upon their practice and to learn from others and apply findings from research and elsewhere. I could go on for a long time. How long I could go on for? Just, like growth mindset, professional curiosity. I mean, really fascinating and linked, aligned concepts that I think are really, really important. The big barrier that we've still got, I think, in England and Wales, particularly on the adult side I'm talking about, is that of insufficient time and space. Time and space is so important. Practitioners are currently stretched, and that does mean that the focus on areas such as critical reflection, it can quickly suffer. So ongoing recruitment of staff, really essential. We need to stabilise the service and then move in this direction, I would say.
I was, as you were talking, I was thinking as well about what you said, Joe, at the start about taking this hat on and putting that hat on. And I struggle with that concept a bit, because actually I don't want people to take one hat off and put. I think we should constantly be looking at the surroundings. We are constantly assessing and reassessing. We are constantly managing risk. We are constantly supporting Desistance. So I think it'd be good to see it as more of the identity. I don't know how you would phrase it, but the identity can't be I suppose it's what you were just saying, Robin. It can't be throwing out the old identity in place of something else. I think just in the time in my career with the probation service, which started in 2001, there's been multiple evolutions. When I first started, officers were still talking about advise, assist and befriend, even though it'd been sort of long gone, supposedly. We were enforcement officers, we were officers of the court, we're probation staff, we're practitioners. We've been through the rhetoric of nothing works, we've been through what works, we've been through be tough on the causes of crime. Our language changes about the work we do and who we do it to or with, more appropriately. I think when we talk about those constant changes, my practitioner heart kind of takes a big gulp and really worries, oh my gosh, more changes. So I think what I prefer to think about it is more of an evolution, because then you don't throw away those old things that are so important. We talk about sort of planned and strategic changes being in response to kind of structured steps, but we work with complex humans. It's not that easy. And so I've been reading up about kind of different change theories, and there's one called emergent change. I don't know if you've heard of it, but there's a really good article by a chap called Burroughs, and he's actually talking about chain supply management and operations management. But what he suggests about emergent change is based on the assumption that change is this continuous thing. It's open-ended, and at times it can be somewhat unpredictable. And what makes it unpredictable is the process of you aligning and realigning an organisation to the changing environment. So that means that change is really fluid and continuous. And I kind of really like that, because I think it's sort of what we're asking people on probation to do. Going back to identity, we want them to shape their identity to be more aligned with what is pro-social. And then they almost have to adjust and respond as those around them adjust and respond to the changes they make, because they want to feel like that sense of belonging. So I definitely agree with Robin in terms of people need to be empowered to have the opportunity to be curious, to critically reflect. And I think lots of research saying that actually good professional practice is just driven by that knowledge of the latest research. And that dates, even like Professor Eileen Munro, who did a big child protection investigation in this country, she talks about that. So I think my personal reflection is we should continue to develop our identity aligned with the research, of improving our understanding about desistance and risk management, and be thinking about the why of what we're doing. But despite all that, the core of what we do remains the same. It's public protection at its heart, and what better way to do that than kind of facilitating someone's journey. So I think in the USA, which I think where a lot of your listeners come from, that Brian Lovins, I heard talk about the difference between probation service identity moving from that referee to a coach model. And I was really lucky to hear him talk at an APA conference in San Francisco. And I really related to what he was saying, actually. I hope that movement goes forward.
I love Brian. He's been on the show. He did an episode where we talked about that article that you're referencing, or that belief of the probation officer moving from that of a referee to a coach. And I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's, again, part of what you're saying. It's not throwing out what we've done, our history. We're just building and growing. That's what I tell resistive practitioners sometimes. This isn't flavor of the month. We're just building on our prior knowledge base. And speaking of building, I want to get your opinions on this. I feel we need to invest and train more as to becoming trauma informed, which is a whole other conversation. But what I want to get your inputs on I see a lot of parallels between trauma informed literature and the desistance literature. Do you see those parallels as well, as far as, well, I don't want to spoil your answers, but do you see parallels between trauma informed care and desistance research?
Absolutely, and this is just where it gets really interesting when you see all these parallels between differing approaches, differing models, different schools of thought, etc. And when you see those parallels, it really just strengthens strengthens the evidence, strengthens your belief in that evidence, and so I'd absolutely say there are lots of parallels. In fact, you could say that a trauma-informed approach, at its heart, it's a person-first, service user-centered approach rooted in desistance and strengths-based models, recognises that the causes and impact of trauma are individualised, requires you to recognise individual strengths and skills and seek to build confidence. And this is all set out in the desistance literature, and really interesting area to focus on. And we did commission some research pretty recently, which looked at the types of trauma-informed approaches currently being utilised within probation, and tried to look for some areas of good practice. And we did find good pockets of practice throughout the service that met that criteria of trauma-informed practice, and staff were generally very positive. They identified a number of benefits both for themselves and for those with whom they work. However, in terms of sort of service in its entirety, need to bear in mind that in England and Wales, we've been through a lot of change, but it was felt that we were still at a relatively early stage in the journey. So researchers talked about this journey from being trauma-aware to trauma-informed to trauma-responsive, and we were still really at the early stages of that. So much more to be done in terms of supporting staff, supervising staff, enabling them to work in this way, genuine buy-in from the top, so from senior leadership, so essential for that full embedding. And careful consideration, of course, given to the impacts upon the staff themselves in terms of emotional labour in delivering this work. So really interesting developments, lots of parallels, and also interesting to look both at the sort of probation and the youth, on the youth side as well, lots of developments with children as well.
I think it's really interesting that sometimes when new theories are shared and promoted, sometimes old theories and approaches are seen to be competing. And I think the reality is that often that integration is much more preferential. So I think it's useful to think about the different approaches as different tools to use. So ideally, you'd get to know the people you're working with and understand what will work best to support their change. So I think whilst the core relationship is one of the most significant factors, as we've said multiple times today, I think how we work with someone can differ greatly. So in a really practical sense, even I've worked with people who've preferred a real formal approach and they love a worksheet and you get it out and they get excited. And then other people who cringe at the moment you walk in with a piece of paper in your hand and they're like, ah. And so I hope I'm not being really too simplistic there than thinking about practical sense, but I would say it's about reading what will work best with a specific individual at a given time, but also knowing that that could well change over the time you work with them, sometimes even in the short space of a week or something. So you have to adjust your practice accordingly. So I think the trauma-informed approach and the core principles kind of within absolutely support desistance. I think it enables practitioners to create environments that promote that psychological safety to help stabilise and engage people. I think individuals can then be supported in that processing of the underlying causes of their behaviour, and which might include trauma, before developing their kind of sense of self. But that said, I think not all of those we work with will be able to address, or certainly not resolve, their trauma in the time that they're with us. We're very time limited and we've got resource implications, as Robin said. And it might not be the right time for them to do it, but I think it still remains really important to work in that trauma-informed manner and, where appropriate, kind of refer them on to services. I think I'd also be really interested to think how other theories like shame and the brain injury and all those things can be integrated. So, me and Robin have talked about this before, but, you think as a practitioner, you need to be trauma-informed, you need to be gender responsive, you need to be culturally competent. That feels like a lot, but ultimately it's about an individual, what they experienced, how they experienced it, which led them into the justice system, and what will work best for them personally to kind of move them towards that pro-social identity out of the system.
Exactly. And you talked about you've noticed competing theories, if you will. And I referenced that earlier when I was talking about how I bristle when people say the science is settled. And again, I could indict myself and say, I remember when I was hardcore R&R disciple, I'd just been blessed by Dr. Bonta as an LSMI master trainer. But I recall going around and around with practitioners about how trauma is not criminogenic. But years later, the more I learn about trauma, it's like, well, it's more foundational to a lot of these criminogenic things. You can't simply write it off as a responsivity consideration. And again, back to the competing theories, I recall when I was first introduced to desistance theory, I had the good pleasure of learning a lot from Dr. Ralph Sarin, who wrote an excellent paper essentially saying, listen, the R&R framework and the desistance framework aren't in competition. They're 2 points on a continuum. So stop arguing about which has more efficacy behind it. And as you said, Tammie, just put that in your tool belt of how can I best apply this to those I serve. Speaking of emerging knowledge, I've really gone down the rabbit hole of neurocriminology. Robin, I know you've done some work around traumatic brain injury. Do you feel this is an area of research, just brain science or becoming neuroscience informed? I love what you pointed out, the differences earlier between trauma informed, trauma responsive, trauma aware. At this point, I would just be giddy if probation officers were neuroscience informed, just to help, again, inform their practices, particularly around how they apply cognitive behavioral interventions and the like. What thoughts do each of you have on that?
Yeah, so it's another fascinating area. So I won't say I'm an expert on this topic, but as we were saying earlier, the evidence base should continually evolve and continually develop. And I absolutely agree that you see some pieces of research that seem very familiar. I think particularly when you've been researching in the area for a while, so many findings, I suppose, over time, they don't surprise you anymore. But then you do see some findings and you think, wow. And I think that's certainly the case with traumatic brain injury. So we commissioned another paper on this area. It was produced by Hope Kent and Hugh Williams. Now, over the last 20 years, Hugh has published extensively on the topic. He's also been an active advocate for better recognition and management of neurodisabilities in the criminal justice system. And in that paper, he sets out some of the prevalence figures around traumatic brain injury among children and adults. And they're just striking. I mean, it was wow. It was one of those wow moments, I think, with research. And it's actually been called a silent epidemic by researchers. So, yeah, real focus is needed here. So training to support practitioners in understanding the impact of traumatic brain injury seems so essential, alongside screening tools to try and identify it as soon as possible. And I think it also links to this, again, supports the need for a multidisciplinary approach, so working between healthcare, education, justice and social care systems to really maximise individuals' life chances and prevent future revolving door reoffending. So we published that paper just while I've got the opportunity. Another paper that we published was all around neurodiversity and the lessons for those working in youth justice, which was kindly produced by Amanda Kirby, who's a real expert in the area. Well worth following on LinkedIn too, Amanda. Again, figures are just really striking, extensive evidence of co-occurrence between conditions, interlinking with adversity and childhood traumas. And so Amanda stresses how it's so important to create that formulation for each individual. So it's that individualized approach again, using information ideally gathered from multiple sources, and then you can really begin to fully understand the individual in the context of their lives. And that's the approach that we follow within the Inspectorate. A strong link here to our inspection standards, where we always stress the need for assessment to be well-informed, analytical and personalised, actively involving that individual being supervised.
I really don't feel like I know enough about this area to talk on the subjects, but what I would say is I did a stint working with young adults previously, and I remember going to a talk about the prevalence of brain damage through brain trauma in the prison population, and the researchers kind of looked at a sample of people who'd been knocked unconscious for a minimum of 20 seconds and above in their young adult lives, and I remember being really surprised how high that percentage was, and they found significant links to impulsivity, poor decision making and a lack of control around social behaviour. So I think the speakers were really encouraging us as participants who were working with young adults at the time to just explore any instance of brain trauma as part of the assessments. And they kind of suggested we provide additional support to those who did disclose brain trauma around developing those skills to compensate for the deficits. So the probation service in the UK, we've got like a toolkit called Choices and Changes, which is to support the maturation process. So that I would be doing those sort of exercises with that group of people.
Well, I don't want to let either of you go before I talk about my favorite topic on this podcast, that of the process of desistance from crime. Usual, regular listeners of the podcast know this is one of my passions, and this one of the reasons I reached out to both of you to have you on the program. Robin, why don't we start with you? Maybe just give your definition of desistance from crime, and or tell us what first drew you to study that phenomenon of people exiting from a life of crime and delinquency.
Well, I think it goes some way back. I used to do a lot of research around assessment, so offender assessment, the assessment process, and at that time, the focus in terms of the literature was very much sort of what works model, risk needs responsivity, and designing assessment tools that fitted well with those principles. But then alongside that was the burgeoning desistance literature. And what really interested me was how this could be all brought together. And in fact, the very first academic insights paper that we published was on this topic. We were really, really fortunate to get Shad Maruna and Ruth Mann, two fantastic authors. They worked on this first paper, which summarised the development of the desistance and what works research literature, and how the continual development of evidence-based practice would be best supported through a recognition that both approaches are valuable and they can be highly complementary. And I found that really interesting because there were times when there were some disputes, really, I think, and arguments, and could it really fit together or not? And I think that paper's a really good one in setting out that that they can support each other. And in fact, they make this point that these paradigm wars, be it around methodologies or other things, they can be quite a time-wasting distraction, I think, from the shared goal of helping people turn their lives around. And as a researcher, I'm just always interested in research, whatever its type, being as robust and rigorous as possible, so maximising its full potential. So that was the very first paper, and we across the papers that we've published, it's been a sort of continual theme. So we had another one which focused on assessment, just took me right back to my early days. And that again highlighted the possibilities from integrating R&R principles and desistance principles, so notably strengths-based approaches. And then we had another paper more recently, so Hazel Kemschel, who's again a brilliant academic here in England and Wales. She produced a paper on a blended approach to risk management. This was about how desistance and risk management can operate in tandem to achieve both non-offending and public safety. And she sort of set out really as two sides of the same coin. And practitioners always need to be looking for that appropriate balance in each individual case between risk and rights, protection and integration, desistance, supportive work and control. And then it carried on. There was another paper more recently. Hazel worked on another paper with Kieran McCartan, and that considered desistance, recovery, and justice capital, and how that could all be brought together. And I just get more and more interested. I think the more things are brought together, blending these key findings and insights from a range of models, disciplines, and types of research, as well as from across jurisdictions as well. And when you bring it all together, you see that many findings are overlapping, which I think really increase their strength, their credence. So we consistently see the importance of things such as relationships, the establishment of positive, respectful, trusting relationships, collaborating with a person being supervised in establishing goals and finding solutions, building upon strengths as well as addressing needs wherever possible, taking that individualized approach. So recognizing that we're all different, all our strengths and challenges are different, we're all shaped by differing combinations of characteristics, experiences and circumstances. The importance of building and maintaining motivation, helping the individual form personal and social bonds, and providing the right opportunities and support at the right time. And this, you don't find these findings in just one part of the literature. It's spread across, different schools of thought, different models, different theories, and it just becomes stronger and stronger as you see it consistently raised. And also the importance of positive language. I think that's something that's been increasingly recognised. I think I'd throw that in as well. So the importance of positive, considerate, non-stigmatising, and empowering language.
I don't know if either of you are aware of the work of Dr. Ralph Sarin. He's one of my Canadian connections. But Robin, when you were talking about how you were initially drawn in because of the assessment aspects of this, Dr. Sarin has published quite a lot of work and actually developed some assessments measuring desistance correlates, which I really found fascinating. He also talked about the same thing you mentioned as far as the risk-need responsivity framework and the desistance approach are not two sides of a coin, but rather 2 points on a continuum. And I think at least previously, folks struggled with that. You probably saw the same thing I saw, a little bit of partisanship almost going on there, almost like we saw years ago between the Good Lives model folks and the R&R folks. But I think if we can all play in the same sandbox nicely, we can get more benefit to our clients and our stakeholders by taking that holistic approach. Tammie, what about you? What first drew you to this concept of desistance from crime?
I think so. I started my probation career in quite a small town, and I would, if I'm honest, I can remember thinking, "Oh my gosh, I've seen this one person, and then I'm seeing like their son, and then when their grandsons start coming through, like, oh my goodness, what are we doing here?" So I think I was drawn to think about how do we support people make real change, because it felt, when I first started, I felt there was a lot of controls imposed which were needed to manage risk. I'm like, well, how do you support people to really change inside so that those controls aren't needed? And so I think probably started to look more and more at Desistance to try and understand what I was doing and why I was doing it, I guess. I really liked the paper that Robin mentioned earlier about from Maruna and Mann, because I felt it. I'm not an academic per se, but I think it really helped me to understand the concepts. I think quite often, we talked about this earlier, didn't we, that one theory is sometimes thrown out for another theory, and I really appreciate. I think it's really the blend and the dialing up or dialing down of risk versus desistance, depending on what's in front of you. And I think quite often, when you try and lift a theory off the page like desistance and try and operationalise it's quite a challenge when you're thinking about high risk and very high risk harm people, because sometimes they're not at the stage of change where they can manage without those controls being imposed, because we have to think about public safety. So that's, I think, why it's been hard to kind of put it in a practical sense, which is why I think the blend is really important. But I think regardless of the stage of change and the risk level someone's at, I think it really helps to work through a desistance lens. And the best example I can ever think about with that is a young man I was working with who he'd committed a robbery, and he'd gone to prison, and I think he got a 3 or 4 year sentence. And all throughout his sentence plan objectives and assessment was very much, this was an alcohol feud offence which was targeting a victim for a particular reason about what the victim looked like. So all his sentence plan objectives were all around that. But every time you tried to go near any of that, he just was really resistant and really kind of balked at it. And he came out and he was allocated to myself, and I decided to take a different tact. And I noticed he got really excited because he got a job in a tattoo parlour, and he was talking about art, and he was only sweeping the floors and cleaning up, but he was really animated whenever he spoke about art, and particularly manga art. So I suggested he draw his offence account through his manga art, but I said, don't focus on the offence. I was like, focus on how you were feeling, focus on what was going on, focus on the night before, the morning of. And what transpired actually was it wasn't necessarily it wasn't the victim's specifics that he was targeting. He had been triggered from some historical trauma. He had split up with a partner who was the mother of his child. There was no contact had with them, and he was really angry and upset. He wanted to be a father like he hadn't had to him. All these sort of things, which led to really different sentence plan objectives with him. So I think that shows that sometimes when you come at it through understanding and that desistance lens, you might be able to get people to open up a little bit more and understand them, and then kind of support them manage their own risk. And the same, I've had a chap who was really into music, really resistant to talk to me, but I was like, okay, make an album of your life, pick 4 tracks from your youth, pick 4 tracks from where it started to go wrong, 4 from where you're at now, 4 from where you want for your future. And what that enabled him to do was to really start talking about risk factors in a really neutral way that didn't feel scary or intimidating. And I think, to me, that, I don't know if I've got this right, but to me that's working through a desistance lens where you're almost, someone once said it's like having 2 tracks mixed into each other. So you've got 2 music playing and they're blended, and sometimes you can hear one track, sometimes you can hear the other, but sometimes you can hear both tracks and they make one song. And to me, true desistance-based practice is you hand over the dials and controls of that mix in the music to the person on probation. So that my hope is that we always kind of work with one eye through that lens. So that's what attracts me to it. Long-term change, I guess. That's the short answer.
Tammie, I often have to remind myself that these conversations are being recorded because I'm such a lifelong learner. I was literally taking copious notes as you were talking, and then it dawned on me, Joe, you don't have to write this down. It's being recorded. But that was awesome when you talked about the 2 tracks. I'm going to totally steal that analogy. I wanted to comment, too, because at a point you talked about the difficulties of taking the research and then operationalizing it. And I was reflecting on how, for example, Bont and Andrews published The Psychology of Criminal Conduct, the first edition, back in 1994, I want to say. And the field of corrections is finally getting to the point that that's become an accepted body of knowledge. And of course, we're sort of going through that with all of the desistance literature. What has your experience been like over there as far as putting the research into practical use for the practitioner? And or just as you just did, Tammie, what would you tell a listener out there who is a practitioner, a probation officer, a parole officer, who said, I want to start doing desistance, but my agency is all about adherence to the risk-need responsivity framework? What are 1 or 2 things they could do to start infusing that spirit of desistance, if you will, into the management of their caseloads?
Great question. I think some of it comes down to what Robin said earlier. Some of it's in the language we use. We're responsible for our own language and how we are with the people we work with. I think some of it is that co-creation. And I know if your agency isn't necessarily bought into that, and you could think about it in the risk-need responsivity angle in terms of speak to the people you work with about what helps to keep them safe. What are they putting in place, and try and build that into your assessments? Because I guess another analogy that I like around the blend is practitioners almost have lots of different pans on the boil on their oven, and they're watching some pans are going to boil over, some pans are simmer, and they're spinning those plates. So I think it's just about how you keep watch over what's boiling, and how you give control where you can to the person. Sometimes you can't because they're not in that position, because they're where they are on the cycle of change. But so, yeah, I don't know, Robin, have you got any other things about operationalising it where there's an R&R lead?
So I think that there's a big point just to begin with around, which I mentioned earlier, around knowledge mobilisation. So I think it's one of the traps that as researchers we fall into, is that we undertake a big piece of work and produce a big report, and then that's it, job done. But of course, in the investment, that's not going to work. So you have to think really hard about knowledge translation. So how to try and disseminate findings in a really user-friendly way, but then go beyond that towards knowledge mobilization, and that's then the two-way interaction. And this is where, and again mentioned it earlier, where practitioners also need time and space to be able to engage with the research findings. So assuming as researchers, I think we have a responsibility to try to ensure that the findings are communicated in an accessible way, but then work with practitioners. But we all need the time and space to do this well, and I think that's the challenge, is trying to free up practitioners to be able to reflect on the research findings, think about how it supports what they're currently doing, or how it might challenge some of the current approaches and the adjustments that they may seek to make. And so I think it's a practitioner level. It's also at a policy, commissioning level as well. So I see it at the moment in England and Wales around assessment. So we had developments on the youth side when the tool changed from what was called Asset to Asset Plus, but that move was to try and integrate more of the desistance literature. And we're seeing similar developments on the adult side now, so much thinking around sort of the next assessment tool that is used. We've had Oasis in England and Wales for quite some time, very much built upon R&R principles. So now the thought is, how do we move on from this and integrate other findings?
I love, as you said, looking at the different approaches. And one of the things I always try to do as a former practitioner, former probation officer of high-risk clients, is put myself in the chair and in that lens and take on the perspective of the probation officer who's being tasked with all these things, as you said, Tammie, all the different pots and pans on the boiler, and realize that we have to, I struggle with my words here, simplify. I don't want to say dumb it down, but simplify it and dole it out in a manner that they can handle. One of the things I look for are sort of common denominators that help folks link that research. And I'm curious, one of the themes in Desistance, of course, is building social capital. And I know from the risk need responsivity framework, peers is one of those big criminogenic drivers. But what I like about the Desistance approach is it's much more strength-based. We're saying build your social capital versus just trying to squelch all of your risky peers and make them go away. They've got to be replaced with positive folks. Plus, we know from the Desistance literature that it's more than just the social learning theory aspect that we take in R&R about negative peers. There's so much more ancillary benefit that can come from building that social capital. So that's one of those sort of, okay, one thing you can start is just look at your network of individuals in your lives, and you'll start reaping the benefits of that. Is that an approach? Or again, I'm looking at some comparative things between, we're still in the infancy over here in the United States of operationalizing desistance. But again, based on your experience with the working probation and parole officers over there carrying a caseload, some of those themes, at least, that you could get across to distill down some of the more abstract theory.
I would say I think social capital is a massive one, and I can't believe we didn't say that. But I do think there's some lack of understanding about what we mean by that. We talk about go and develop your social capital. But like I said at the start when I introduced myself, it's not that easy. I've just started a new job. It's really hard. So I think, and here's another plug, but in the Offender Management in Custody Effective Practice Guide from HMIP, we talk about the different aspects of social capital. So we talk about you need to actively participate in it. You need to have those shared values and norms. You know, there's I can never say this word, but there's that reciprocity. It's not enough. You know, you can't just keep taking from a bank. You've got to put into it as well, kind of thing. So I do think when we talk about social capital, we also need to talk about the pains of desistance, how difficult it can be. We need to talk about the structural stuff. You know, some communities might be harder to accept me because of my ethnicity or because of my offending, all those sort of things. So I think we need to think in careful detail about social capital. I had a really interesting conversation with the Northern Ireland research team from the probation service, and they say they found social capital really hard, particularly when someone's been convicted of, say, a sexual offence, because they are such small communities. Everybody knows everyone's business. So when you're trying to build that capital, it's just such a challenge for them. So I think, as well as sort of supporting practitioners do that, we need to be realistic about the challenges it can bring, and you might want to start by making small connections and build up and kind of understanding the framework, I guess.
I think it's a really interesting area in the research literature at the moment. So we published a paper which was all around social capital. So focused on social capital, and that on its own was quite complex. So setting out all the different types of social capital and all the potential links to desistance. So yeah, really great paper. And then we had another paper more recently, which I mentioned briefly, which was the one on justice capital, which is I think a newer concept. And that in that it talks about social capital, but then as part of recovery capital, there's social capital, physical capital, human capital, and cultural capital. There's all these differing types. And justice capital is about the justice institutions themselves and what they can do to facilitate desistance. The other area that's covered in that paper is getting into the socio-ecological framework, which I find really quite helpful to think about practice in that way, because it has the differing levels, and these four levels of individual, interpersonal, community, and societal. And I think, you know, you can see in the literature increasing recognition over recent years of the need to think about these differing levels. So I think one criticism is that at one point in time, it was very much focused on the individual and not everything around the individual. And it's so important to consider the individual in the context of their lives and their backgrounds and their histories.
Full disclosure, I'm a master trainer of the Level of Service Case Management Inventory. The LSCMI is one of the bigger risk assessments over here in North America that is pretty standard. And when I look at that assessment in the domain of companions or peers, there's actually only 4 questions, and they're essentially measuring, do you have risky friends? Do you have risky associates? And on the flip side, do you have enough positive acquaintances and or positive friends to buffer against risk? But as far as when you were both just doing a great job of fleshing out the depth and breadth of what we mean by social capital, it dawned on me, I could assess a high-risk individual, and if they change their social network and simply traded out folks, for example, who've never been involved in the criminal justice system, and I'm sort of oversimplifying this, but that alone would move the needle. I mean, we're not looking at everything that you both just articulated. It's really just taking it more, again, from this social learning lens. And as long as the people in your lives fit that definition of pro-social, your risk is going to go down. But that's a whole other animal than what you all have all been describing, and that we all know about what really goes into social capital. And Tammie, you touched on this too. It's people who you can be vulnerable with, people who you can share emotion with and share capital with, really. And again, that's a level up from the way that it's being done in the risk need responsivity camp. Another big thing that I can't let either of you leave without talking about when we talk about desistance vis-a-vis the risk need responsivity framework is the importance of identity, and specifically identity transformation. I've trained I don't know how many risk assessors over here and done I don't know how many risk assessments, but I've never asked a client if their identity has evolved. To the listeners who may not know anything about desistance, maybe give your take on the role that identity and identity transformation plays in the process of desistance from crime.
Yeah, so we've seen in the literature quite a lot recently around building pro-social identity, particularly on the youth side. So in England and Wales, we have the child first principles, which have become more and more influential over time. There's sort of 4 parts to that, and one part is building pro-social identity, and it builds on research undertaken by the likes of Neil Hazel. And it talks about, so it's really reflecting this period of adolescence. So it's such an important time around identity development, loads of transitions. And so the child first approach promotes this focus on shifting potentially pro-offending identities to those which are pro-social. So helping children to see themselves in ways that encourage positive behaviours. And there's been attempts to also operationalise that. So there's a whole constructive working framework, which has various aspects to it, but a big bit around identity awareness and thinking about the identity messages coming from the child, and also those messages you're giving to the child. So yes, well, I think it's one of those areas where on the youth side, it's really been taken forward really well, but less. So whilst that's focused on youth, I think there's real lessons as well on the adult side, particularly transitions for those moving from the youth to the adult system on this magic 18th birthday, as though somebody becomes a totally different person when they become 18. Of course, the reality is not that at all.
I'm a big believer in identity. I think the crux of everything we do is around identity. And there was I don't know who wrote it, but there was a police officer who wrote a book, and he talked about, and it was about evidence, and he basically said every contact leaves a trace. And I think that was talking about things like fingerprints and evidential stuff like that. But I really relate to that sort of phrase around people. every contact will leave a trace. So someone's identity is formed, the way it is formed, because of the experiences in their life. Their identity, who they are, who they represent, who they present to the world versus who they are internally, is a result of the things they've experienced. I mean, some would say it's DNA as well, and obviously things like brain damage that we talked about before will have an impact. But that would also suggest that you can have every contact will have an impact in supporting someone transition to that more pro-social identity. So for me, the best assessments, the best interventions are where you are supporting that person transition to that new identity. And I had a letter. A chap wrote to me because I was leaving to be to a different probation office, and I wrote to him because he was in prison saying, "I'm really sorry, I'm going, but wish you all the luck," kind of thing. And he sent me a great letter back, and I think it sums up probation. And it basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, I'd like to say I wouldn't have been able to do it without you, Tammie, but that's not true because I was on the right path. But you give me a kick up the backside at the right time, and it was nice to have someone to kind of, I felt that was on the journey alongside me. And I thought that's brilliant. That's what I want. And it's that. It's like, you know, the identity. They need to shift to that identity. They need to want it. They need to identify where they're going. But then that new identity needs to be accepted internally by themselves. But then it needs to be accepted by society and the communities they're in, for them to wear that identity truly.
Oh, I was going to say, I love the point of contact point that you were making, and reminding me again of the aforementioned Dr. Sen, who I referenced earlier. He made that same point to me at one point. He is a big believer that there's no such thing as sort of agnostic supervision. Every contact, like you said, every office visit, every field visit that the criminal justice practitioner has, you're either promoting desistance or promoting persistence in a life of crime and delinquency. But there's no such thing as agnostic. You're not just having the null approach. So you have to be really mindful and give due diligence to that. And it also reminds me, speaking of identity, of the importance of labeling theory. And maybe that's the answer to my question for the practitioners. Just be mindful of the language you used. I was doing a training just yesterday where I was challenging individuals to get through the process of going over the results of risk assessments without using the word risk, because that is so damning. And we throw it around just like we throw around words like offender or high risk or repeat offender, that type of thing. But every one of those points of contact, like you said, Tammie, is having an effect on that individual's identity. I was going to conclude by saying along those lines, Shad Maruna has done some really great work in this lane when he talks about degradation ceremonies and how the criminal justice system is really set up to highlight individuals' failures in life. Every contact they have with the criminal justice system is really promoting their failures, whether it's arrest, conviction, probation violation, sentencing. And he talks about how the formality and the sort of austere approach we take in the courts, it's what are we celebrating? We're celebrating an individual's failure. And again, he calls these degradation ceremonies, and he's talked about how we need to flip that around and have ceremonies that really promote successes for a population which has really not experienced a lot of those traditional milestone celebrations that you and I all had, whether it was getting your driver's license, graduating from high school, getting your first part-time job. So we really need to realize their perspective that they haven't been celebrated. They've really just been highlighted the failures in their lives.
Yeah, so we see a lot of interest around diversion from the system. So it's picking up on some of these points that you're saying about potentially stigmatization, labeling, the potential negative aspects of being within the criminal justice system. So there's a lot of work around diversion, but again, particularly on the youth side. But of course, some people will be in the system because their offending often is so serious, or it can be very persistent, or a combination of the two. So once people are within the system, it's so important to think about language. And there's differing languages, of course, you can employ, because there's languages that you use as a practitioner to practitioner, and also across agencies. So the language of risk is really interesting because it's embedded, but it's across agencies. It's often sort of a multi-agency language, and that language can be appropriate and necessary. But then there is the language that you use as a practitioner when interacting with the person on probation or the child, whoever it is. And so you can use differing languages, of course, depending on who you're talking to. So it might be appropriate to talk about risk in one context, but then not in another, because of the sort of the negative aspects to it. So can you flip it round? Can the language become more positive? Thinking very much future focused, strengths based, but also, thinking about people's safety, their own safety and the safety of people around them. And if you think about safety rather than risk, I think everyone sort of buys into that. It's something that we all want, including as an individual. You want to be safe, people around you safe, and that enables that more positive work then to take place.
I love that approach when you talked about using safety rather than risk. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, ignoring all the things that come with risk, but we're still attending to that variable as well. Tammie Burroughs, Robin Moore, thank you both so much for being on the program. I look forward to our paths crossing again in some iteration and or having you both back on the podcast. Until then, I will leave a link to articles that we've discussed during the interview for folks if they want to check out some of the research that has been cited by my two awesome guests. Thank you both again, and until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A major criminologist podcast thank you to both Tammie Burroughs and Robin Moore for joining us this week. As promised, I have left relevant links in the episode description of this program to academic insights, specifically some of their papers related to the process of desistance from crime, also a link highlighting their research team. So please check out those links. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, program design, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, or Tammie Burroughs, or Robin Moore on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
I am making progress, but I need to be realistic about what I am. I'm going to grow into it. And I just think personal reflections like that can help us with our practice, because we understand change is hard, and it's no different for someone who's trying to transition from a pro-offending kind of identity to that pro-social one.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.